Okay. Hi, everybody. I'm Madlon. I also go by Madlon. That's my DJ name. Today, we're going to be talking a little bit about music theory and composition for producers. So, I know music theory can be kind of an intimidating topic, especially if you don't necessarily have a background in music when you get started with production, or even if you've been producing for a while and it feels like this area that you don't want to touch too much. So the first part of this, I just want to talk a little bit about the benefits that are kind of surprising and come up when you actually don't have a huge background in music theory. There are actually some advantages you have. And I say that coming from someone who's classically trained. I had a lot of piano lessons, and I learned how to play flute and jazz saxophone earlier in life. And what I found when I started producing was that some of these things actually started tripping me up when I went to start making dance music. So there are just a couple of points I want to make about learning music theory fresh, or if you've been producing for a while, getting more familiar with music theory if you don't happen to have a background in it. So the thing about production is you don't need a ton of theory to get started. A little goes a long way, and you don't need to be like a virtuoso on any given instrument in order to be a really solid, talented producer. So I just want to dispel that notion that you need to have like all of this super complex theory knowledge, especially right off the bat. You might be tempted to write overly complex melodic ideas if you do have a background in music theory. So that's a word of caution if you do, like me. When I first started out, I had this really insidious problem where I would just like write these melodies that would just be freaking obnoxious because they were so complicated and they had so many notes in them. So you're less likely to fall into that trap if you're not super familiar with music theory, and especially if you're making electronic dance music, having the ability to approach things with a little bit more simplicity is and can be quite a strength in some cases. You also don't need to unlearn a bunch of stuff that doesn't serve you like I did. So there's a lot of theory that I learned and I never used again, and I haven't touched. And you have a bunch of tools at your disposal as a producer. And we're going to talk about a bunch of those. This was something that was requested a lot in the Facebook group. There are things that you can use to assist you if you don't feel super confident in your music theory knowledge or skills. We have a lot of stuff available to us so that you can focus on making really great music and not get tripped up with trying to remember like what mode you want to be in or whatever. And then finally, you may be less likely to have to shift your ingrained passive mindset. And this is something to look out for if you have grown up playing an instrument or playing in a lot of acoustic groups. Something that happens is that if you're playing in a band, especially if it's a pretty hierarchical structure, you may be sort of stuck in a silo and feel sort of like your particular part is something that you can just put on autopilot, and you're playing other people's music quite a bit. So shifting from thinking about how do I execute this music that someone else has already written and moving over to how do I compose and create my own tracks, that can be quite a jarring shift. And if you're approaching production from scratch and you don't have a musical background, it can actually be an advantage to learn how to actively make music at the same time as you're building your theory knowledge. So I just want to preface all of this with hey, don't worry if you're coming from either side of it. There are advantages and disadvantages to engaging with music theory, whether you have a background in it or not. And I know it can be really intimidating and really dry. And there are ways that we can handle it and break it down into more manageable chunks. So let me scroll over for a second. Got a lot of screens going on here. Come on. Please. Okay. There we go. Yay, now I can scroll. Okay, thanks for your patience. All right. So, basically, regardless of what background you're coming to this from, and regardless of what level of production skill you feel like you're at right now, trust your ears is the number one thing. Make sure that you are relying on what sounds good to you. And don't feel bad about any tools you need to use. I had to unpack a lot of baggage when I first started producing about what felt like sort of taking shortcuts or cheating when I was starting to engage with some of the tools that are available to producers. So don't feel bad about using tools. It's totally fine. Production is a huge job. You can use tools that are at your disposal because you need to make your own unique music and whatever you need to do in order to accomplish that is totally fine. So I have at the end of this document a list of the terms and definitions that I think are most useful and most relevant for producers, especially if you're more at the beginning or intermediate stages. And I don't necessarily want to bore you with the details of those, but we can send out this document and you can have a copy. We're also recording this, so there will be a video later. And let me know in the chat if there's a particular term that I mentioned that you don't know what it is, and I can quickly explain it. But I don't want to spend our time going over too much of each of these specific music theory terms, particularly for the people who already have some familiarity with them. So what I did want to cover briefly, though, is the terms and definitions and concepts that may not be particularly useful to you as a producer. So it's definitely massively helpful to learn a little bit of music theory so that you can make your way around your DAW. But there's also some stuff that's relatively useless or only useful if you're trying to do a very particular thing. So among those are learning how to read sheet music. Not really something producers need to know. Guitar tab is in a similar vein. If you want to learn an acoustic instrument and incorporate that into your productions, that's awesome, but totally not required. You can make perfectly fine melodies without having any knowledge of how sheet music works. You also don't need to have everything memorized. I really try to avoid memorizing anything unnecessarily. There's a lot of stuff that you can just look up if you forget what it is exactly. I think the more important thing is that you know what concepts exist that may be useful to you and have the ability to look them up if you forget the specifics. So there's a lot of terms in music theory, but if you have access to Google, you're going to be fine. You also probably don't need to know how to improvise over chord changes in particularly a jazz context. This is something that a skill I carried with me into production that I just have not used. And this is particularly true if you're not making jazz or funky sort of music, but you're mostly focused on more simple melodies or just dance music that's a little bit closer to pop than it is to jazz. So it quite depends on what you're making, but I don't touch this skill set at all anymore personally. And then there's also just like a bunch of obscure things like all sorts of different time signatures and modes and different chord structures and really complicated stuff that you can use once you get comfortable if you want to. But if you try to get a bunch of different like fancy time signatures into your knowledge base, that's too early. It's probably kind of a waste of time until you're at a level where you're okay with kind of the basic ones, and then you want to add some sort of interesting complexity to your music. So it doesn't need to be like you don't need to have a ton of like complex advanced music theory knowledge. So I want to talk mostly in this workshop about writing melodic components, writing chord changes and melodies, and then talking a little bit about the tools that are available to us as producers, because these were some of the things that people were most curious about, and I think are a little bit more interesting than just talking about like what time signatures are. So I'm gonna grab some lemonade and then we'll jump into it. Any questions so far? You can pop them in the chat or just let me know. Okay, I think we're good. So songwriting. This is something, so I'm a like trance and progressive and melodic stuff type of producer. So writing melodies and getting them to have like the right emotion is super important in my genre. And it was one of the things that was most challenging and most intimidating to me when I first started producing, because I'd spent a lot of time playing other people's songs and I wasn't really sure at all where to start when it came to making my own. So there's also, I think, this common misconception, if you don't know a lot about how people write songs, where it seems like all your favorite artists are just, they wake up one day with like this gorgeous, perfect melody in their head, and then they get into the studio and they like write it down and it's wonderful and it's brilliant and it works. That sometimes happens. But if you're like me and you have more of a, you aren't like, haven't been professionally producing for like 20 years or whatever, that's usually not the case. Sometimes I'll hear something in my head or a bit of something, and in that case, it's great. You can, record it on your phone and then go see how it works. But most of the time when I'm writing melodies, it's very much a trial and error and more of a messy, iterative process than that. So most of the time, melodies aren't just going to materialize in your head unless that's a wonderful talent that you possess. And if that's the case, that's awesome. But most of the time, for most of us, I think that typically it's going to be a little bit more, a little more work. So basically, I think I'll use a couple of approaches when I'm writing a melody. I don't always like write a melody exactly the same way. So for the structure of a particular melody, you can either get the rhythm first or you can get the notes first. So I have a couple of exercises here that you can try on your own time, or if we have extra time, maybe we can just spend some time at the end working on some stuff. But sometimes you can just write out a rhythm that sounds kind of cool, and then figure out the notes once you find a rhythm you like. Or you might have some sort of order of notes in mind, and then you can set a rhythm to them later. Kind of similar for the whether you have like chord changes or melody first. So sometimes you can employ writing a rhythm first for your chord changes, or you can write the notes first for your chord changes, or you could do that for your melody. And then from your chord changes, you could write a melody, or from your melody, you could write some chord changes. So there are lots of different ways to do it, but I think choosing a starting place is really helpful, especially if you're not really starting from anywhere inspired. And typically, I don't feel inspired. So I have this like little note up here, if you can see it. I don't think waiting for inspiration is ever really a good idea, because I get inspired probably like every couple months maybe. It's not very often. So if I just waited till I was feeling inspired to make music, I probably wouldn't make music that much. So I often find that I'll sit down and start working on something and try to get something to work. And then as I'm writing, as I'm working on it, I'll become inspired, or I'll like something I'm hearing, and I'll follow the thread of inspiration. So I'm definitely of the school of thought where sit down to write first, then inspiration will show up. Otherwise, you're just signing up for writer's block. At least that's how it works for me. So here we go. Scroll down a little bit. So I have another exercise here you can try. Again, we'll make this doc available to you so you can peruse it and try some of this stuff out. I also wrote out this list of how I typically build my melodic foundations, but you can do whatever, order or approach works best for you. So personally, and I'm not saying this is the right way to do it at all. It's just how I do it and how my brain works. And it takes some experimentation to figure out what's good for you. So don't take this as like, you have to do it this way. But for me, I pick an arrangement first, 100% of the time. And that's typically, I'll look at like a reference track that's in roughly the genre that I want to create. And I'll just pop the track into my DAW, and I will put down little markers where the different parts of the song happen. So if we go over to Ableton, go like this. So let's say I have a reference track I'm listening to, so I'll just take notes. So typically an intro will happen over here. And then let's see if I can select it. I'll add a locator like this, and I'll say this is like where it breaks down for the first time. So I'll just do breakdown 1, whatever. And then we'll have like maybe a build at 33. And I'll just go throughout the track doing that and taking notes on where each section happens for my reference track. Sometimes I'll change the arrangement a little bit later, but I'll typically just use the exact same arrangement from my reference track, just to kind of get started. And let's see, hopefully I can get that back. Okay. So I pick my arrangement, and then I always like to write my drop first. I make dance music, so it might be different for you. But I always feel like it's easier to write something that is where the track is going, like where we're going to end up, and then backtrack from there. Because I've found that if I write my breakdown and my build up first, I'll end up in this position where then I'm like, oh, and then what happens? I don't know. And it's a lot harder to figure out what the drop should actually be like if I write it later. I typically pick a key, and I stay in that key as best I can. And then I'm someone who I do like to choose chord changes first usually because in the genres I make, the chord changes sort of, what's the word I'm looking for? They sort of determine the emotional content and the feeling of the track. So to get that right, I'll typically write some chord changes that feel like trance or feel like they have. I typically go for like a little bit melancholy, a little nostalgic, but also still uplifting and not cheesy in any way, but kind of balancing between something that's really sad and something that's really happy. So getting kind of that middle ground. And then I usually find that writing a melody after the chord changes, on top of the chord changes, this might be because I do come from a jazz background and that's where you improvise over chord changes. But I feel more comfortable making my melody once I have that melodic foundation of my chord changes. And then once I'm reasonably happy with my melody, I'll get into things like sound design. And sometimes when I'm at the sound design stage, I'll have to go back and like edit my melody because it's not quite working with the sounds that I want to use or whatever. But I'll typically try to get it pretty close just on piano. Because I've noticed that if I can get it to sound good on something acoustic like piano, it's going to translate well to most synth sound designs. And then I'll just sort of mess with it iteratively. So sometimes there's little problems, like a little section of a melody that's not quite working, where I'll feel like it's a little too cheesy, or it just doesn't quite land right, or it doesn't go quite where I want it to, or where I'm hearing it go. So just trying to kind of tune in and pay attention to where your ear wants the melody to go is a helpful strategy. And then if I'm not getting the right feeling with my chord changes and melody, sometimes I'll just go back to the overall chord structure and think about whether it's really something that's going to work with my intention. So it's a pretty messy process, and sometimes I have to take a long break before something clicks and actually starts working. So that's typically how I write my tracks. And it's it can be pretty quick, or it can take a while. It really varies, and it's important to just be patient with it and try to follow where like the melody wants to go, where you're hearing it need to go. All right. So now I have some tips for you. Let me see if I can scroll more. So there's some just like really simple in like tools in your DAW that are helpful. You want to make sure that your notes are all part of the same scale. Like you want to stay in the same key in general, unless you're doing something really wild and experimental. And you want to make sure your samples and your vocals are all in tune and in the right key. So I've just highlighted here. So this is an Ableton, but it's, I think, pretty similar in other DAWs too. You can transpose your samples using this transpose tool. It goes in steps, which are semitones or half steps. So just make sure that you know what note that means. And then there's also this detune, which is measured in something called cents. And I typically use this for vocals when I'm hearing like a vocal's a little bit out of tune. I will adjust the cents, usually just a little bit. And it's kind of a guess and check process. So I'll just try to hear whether it's sharp or flat, so higher than or lower than where it should be, respectively. and adjust from there. So that's kind of an ear training thing. And you have to be able to sort of like guess and check and do this a fair amount before you start having more like intuitive sense of where things should be melodically. Same thing for your samples, so vocals and other samples. Another way to do this is if you're looking at the sampler, this is again in Ableton, it'll tell you the root of the sample, and you can again adjust so that the sample is more in tune and in key. So that's another way to do that. And let's see if I can, I think I've scrolled away my Ableton. But I can grab it back in just a second. Maybe not. That's why I have screenshots. My goodness. Lots of scrolling. 1 second. Okay, we're back. Okay, so the next section, I just have some more specific methods for writing chord changes and melodies and arrangements. So one thing I like to do if you're struggling to figure out what chord changes you should use is sometimes you can just Google like what the chord changes are for a particular song and it'll tell you. Otherwise, you can also listen to a reference track and sort of decipher the approximate chord changes by ear. This takes a little bit of work and a little ear training, but it can be super helpful when you're just trying to understand your genre conventions and making up your own chord progressions. You can also just make your own up by guessing and checking. Use all of the same notes in that are in your key, in your scale, and then just see if you can come up with some chord changes. So typically, if I'm doing this, I'll just start with one note at a time. And I'll start with just 4 bars, so it doesn't get overwhelming and overly complicated. And once you have 4 notes that kind of work together as root notes or something, you can then add like a third and then a fifth. And then you can experiment with different inversions, which are basically, if you don't know, like different ways of organizing chords so that the bottom note that you started with, that is the root note, is not necessarily the lowest note in pitch for that chord. So I also have just kind of a tip / little exercise here to do this. And then I also just want to note that like if you're quote unquote stealing chord changes, you're not really stealing anything. There are lots and lots of people who use exactly the same chord progression, particularly within a genre. There's like certain chord progressions that get used all the time. So if you take one from a reference track or look one up from one of your favorite tracks, you're not like plagiarizing anything. You're just using a melodic component that's common in your genre. So that was something that I wasn't sure about doing for a long time, but now I steal a lot more, steal quote unquote, a lot more chord changes when I'm making stuff. So writing melodies, this can get a little bit more time consuming and complicated. The trick to melody writing is that you need something that's catchy, but also interesting. And this is kind of the core of why it's so difficult to write a good melody. So it's balancing variation with familiarity and complexity with simplicity. You want your listener to feel like comfortable and familiar and like they can sing along to your melody. And you don't want them to get bored because it's so simple. And if it's too complicated, you'll lose your listener. So it's a bit of a like Goldilocks situation. So how do we do that? There are a lot of different approaches you can take, and you just kind of have to test things out and see what works. Again, trusting your ears above all. But a couple of strategies you can use are rhythmic variation. So you'll want to make sure that you're not using the same rhythm the whole time, but you also want to make sure that you're not changing the rhythm the whole time, so that there's some consistency but not too much. Call and response is a great concept. Basically having one phrase that says something and then another phrase that feels like a reply to that phrase. It's super common across a lot of genres. And it's an excellent strategy for building out your melodic ideas. So thinking about which phrase is your call and which phrase is your response can sometimes help frame how you're writing a melody. A lot of times people use motifs, which are basically these little repeated melodic ideas. And a lot of times when people are using motifs, they'll use the same rhythm a couple of times or throughout the melody, but change the notes up just a little bit. And this is a great strategy for achieving some of that rhythmic variation, and it can be, used in conjunction with call and response. None of these are mutually exclusive, by the way. You can use all of these in the same melody. The other couple of ones, that's more the rhythmic stuff. On the melodic side of things, there's these terms that I became familiar with because of the guys over at EDM Prod. It's an awesome site. They have a lot of great resources. I'd recommend checking them out. They're not paying me, so just a plug for something I think works really well. But they talk about these different types of melodic motion. So stepwise motion is when you have notes in your melody that are close together in intervals. So it's something that's like you're playing the same note again, or you're going a second above or below the note, or even a third. So it's just something that's close in relation to the last note you played. And leapwise motion is like a bigger jump. So like an octave would definitely be like a leapwise jump. And mixing up your stepwise and leapwise motion can be super helpful when you're writing a melody, because it'll add a little bit of variation. And stepwise motion to your listener adds aspects of familiarity, but leapwise motion adds more complexity. So having a good balance of both can be super helpful. One note about leapwise motion, though, you don't want to go too far. So if you have like something more than like probably an octave jump, that can sometimes start getting a little too complex. Depends on context, of course. But if you have like a 2-octave jump for sure in one melody, that's going to be difficult to not only to mix, but it's also going to be difficult for your user to, or your listener to kind of keep track of. It's going to be harder to follow. And then finally, we have chord tones and non-chord tones, which are basically what they sound like. So whatever your current chord is for a given part of the melody, it's good to balance what notes are in the chord that you're currently playing and what notes are not in the chord. And the non-chord tones should still be within your scale, like you do want to stay in key. But if you have a couple of non-chord tones thrown into your melody, they will add a little bit of complexity. So this is another thing to balance when you're writing a melody. And then we have a little exercise if you would like to try it out. I always like to start as small as possible with melodies and just start with like a motif or two, and then get a 4-bar phrase and then an 8-bar phrase. I just think it's a little easier to expand from a smaller chunk. It's a little bit more manageable, but do you. All right, any questions? Gonna have more lemonade and then we'll talk about arranging. Okay, I think we're good. So, arrangement-wise, I already talked about this a little bit, but if you have a reference track you like, just listening to that, taking notes on it in your DAW, and then using that arrangement can be a really helpful strategy. You could also use like a common arrangement structure. So a lot of, and this is typically expressed with letters A through like D or E typically at the most. So there's these letters that are assigned to describe these different parts of the song. So part A would be like the first section, part B would be a different section, part C would be yet another section, and then part A might come again at the end of the song and be very similar or the same as part A at the start. So there are a lot of kind of standard arrangement structures like that that you can basically look up and try to implement. You can also, get creative. Start with something that is more commonly used or you hear in a track that you like, and then just mess with it and make it your own. Or you can just make something up entirely out of the blue. That's cool too. But I've tended to struggle with that personally. It's all good. And then as you're arranging, it's just good to keep your listener in mind. So an arrangement with like really long sections and not much variation can get boring. And an arrangement with not enough time that's devoted to developing a section before you move on to the next section, and if it doesn't feel like it makes sense, then that can be kind of jarring and awkward for the listener as well. Okay, I think we have a question. Okay, by improvising, do we mean composing while recording? I simply think of improvising in a live performance context. Yeah, so improvising, I think when I'm giving the example of like my experience improvising, it's more in like when I was playing jazz saxophone. So that was a context where I was definitely improvising in a live setting. And I was kind of comparing it to production in that, like when you're improvising in a jazz band, for instance, there's the rhythm section, which is like, pianist, guitar, drums, etc., who are playing chord changes, and then the soloist is improvising over the chord changes. And I was referring to that as like a sort of similar thing to production when you're you have chord changes playing, say you have them looping and you're like coming up with a melody. You could do that. You could have like say some kind of MIDI instrument and you could try improvising over the chord changes. That could definitely be one approach, or you could sort of slow things down and do it in a less live way, and just have your chord changes written out and figure out the melody just writing in MIDI notes as you go along. So I hope that kind of answers it. Let me know if not in the chat and I'll try to clarify further. All right. So arrangement wise, that's typically what we got. Okay, sweet. Yes, question answered. Success. Thank you. All right. So I just have some general writing tips. Number one is using a reference track. I really love stealing stuff. And I mean steal in like the least plagiarism type way. But yeah, listening and even transposing a melody, that's something you probably don't want to include in your original work because it's too close. But if you transpose your melody from a track you like, you're doing a couple of things. You're developing a further understanding of what melodies are like in your genre. You're training your ears. You're listening for what works and what doesn't. And you can then take it and mix it up and mess with it until it's unrecognizable, and you can kind of use it as a jumping off point to write your own stuff. So you do want to be more careful with melodies. You shouldn't plagiarize people's melodies, but they can be super helpful tools for developing your own sound and coming up with stuff that is sounds like the genre that you're going for, but also is uniquely yours. So I also talked about this a little bit briefly, but writing out your melodies on something that typically sounds good with whatever melodic component, like a piano, is really helpful, especially if you're tempted, like I am, to want to do everything at once and jump into a bunch of sound design when you're still figuring out what your melodic components are. You can really get yourself into some sort of mess where everything's sort of half done and you don't have a sound that works sound design wise, and you don't have a melody that works, and it's just a whole thing. So I really like to just get everything working on an acoustic instrument first, because I'll feel typically it'll work on something more dancey. So I also strongly encourage you guys to put the key that you're in as part of your project file name, because wasting time trying to figure out what key you're in again, and even like what your chord changes are, writing those down can be helpful too. It's just really frustrating to just go back to a project and then be like, wait, what am I supposed to be doing? What key am I using? What's the root? It's just a waste of time. So if you just include that in your naming conventions of your files, you'll be better off. Try some different stuff out. See what works for you. Experiment. Try doing different things first. And like just test some things and figure out what works best for you. Rhythm first, notes first, whatever. And yeah, just transposing other people's melodies and just listening to a lot of music will help you immensely, so that you can better understand what the music you're trying to make, the genre you're in, or genres you want to make. That can be super helpful. All right. So now that's kind of what I got for songwriting stuff. Just want to talk about some tools and plugins really quick. And again, you guys will get this, so there are lots of links and lists of things. But I just want to make you aware of some of the plugins and tools that are available to you. We're going to cover a couple of like kind of simple stock ones that you might already know, but there are also some paid ones and some additional options that can help you with creating melodic ideas. So there's Scalar. I haven't tried this one out yet, but a friend of mine swears by it, and I've heard some tracks he's made using it, and they're really solid melodically. So this one basically picks up your melodic ideas and makes suggestions for chord changes and stuff. I haven't played with it, but I'm going to buy it. I'm very excited about it. There's a chord generator if you're just looking for a chord generator tool and don't want to write your chord changes by hand. There's Melody Sauce, which can help you create melodies, and Splice, if you're familiar with Splice. If you're not, I highly recommend you get familiar with Splice in general, but they have some MIDI presets basically available that you can use for your projects. They also have a great sample library. It's a subscription model, but it's pretty decent. There's also, I have some links out to just like some top 10 articles for tools and plugins that people recommend trying. And some of them are pretty reasonably priced. So I think generally could be worth it. Then there are just a couple of things I want to make sure everyone's aware of in your DAW. So for staying in key, there are two main ways that I know of that you can make sure that you're staying in the correct scale for your melodic ideas. One of them is just writing out the scale. So we just have like an A natural minor scale here, in however many octaves you're going to use. And then moving these MIDI notes so that they sit behind the line here so that they're not audible, but you can see them as you're writing out your ideas. That could be super helpful. And then once you've done that, you can also fold them. So you just click the fold button up here, and then all the notes in your scale are the only notes that you can see. So you're not going to accidentally put a note there that you don't want. Ooh, cool. Ableton 11 has a scaler in the piano roll now. Nice. I don't have 11. I'm a peasant, so. Okay. You can also use the scale plugin to make sure everything's in key. Takes a lot of brain power for your for your computer, so that's the downside to this, but you can just pop it in there and it'll automatically make sure all your MIDI notes are in key. So if you do this, it might be good to get your melody down and then like freeze and flatten it so that you're not using all the CPU. But it's definitely a solution if you want. For making rhythmic patterns, I'm always on and it's partly because I'm a trance producer, right? Like it's just arpeggiators and delays. I use dotted 8-note delay on like a lot of stuff, and often in combination with other things. So there's some automatic things that you can use to just mix it up rhythmically so you don't have to like write out all of your MIDI notes in interesting rhythms. There are also some paid plugins for rhythmic variation. I haven't tried these, but these get good reviews. And there's a complete list here if you want to go check it out. And then we just have some useful terms and definitions. So this is kind of the little glossary section that I don't want to talk about in too much detail because I don't want people to fall asleep. But you can sort of peruse this, and I have some recommendations in the comments for what to do if you're not super familiar. And there are some kind of bonus resources on each of these things that you can go learn more about them if you need to brush up on your basics or you're not sure what a particular term means. And I've tried to really just include like kind of the big ones that I usually use a lot in making electronic music. So it's pretty high level, and I've just included some of the things that are included in like the vast ocean of music theory. Like these are the things I use most, and outside of that, it's pretty unusual that I'll touch anything else. So hopefully that kind of helps narrow it down if you're trying to figure out what you need to actually know. And then at the end, I just have some weird things about having a classically trained background. So this is a little about me. So I came from this like classical flute, classical piano, ballet dancer, sort of very constrained, doing other people's choreography, playing other people's music. Jazz was like a little bit looser, had a little bit more freedom, but it was still pretty constrained compared to what you can do as an electronic producer. So that's part of why I love making music for myself so much. But there are a lot of like weird little differences about how music works with in the acoustic world versus in the DAW. So visualizing music over time is pretty different. I think if you DJ, you're better prepared to get into a DAW than if you have been like playing some acoustic instrument. at least in my experience. And then thinking about how sound works physically isn't necessarily a huge thing in the acoustic world, beyond like making sure that you're playing the right volume for the people around you to hear. But thinking about sound in a space was something that I wasn't super comfortable with as a mediocre band student. And there's also like the complexity thing that I kind of touched on, where there's like a lot of notes and classical and jazz and really complex melodic ideas that just don't fly on the dance floor. And when you're kind of shifting over to like making your own music, there's no apparent blueprint, and you're just like staring down the empty DAW and trying to figure out, first of all, how this thing works, and second of all, where to even start. And that can be really intimidating. And then also just like on the emotional side of things, classical training can be super intense. So I have all this music theory knowledge, which is awesome. I have these skills, but they came at a steep price. So I've unpacked a lot of jazz band related stuff in therapy, for example. It's can be an intense process, and it can be super tedious and difficult to learn, especially if you're in kind of a like conservatory type environment. So, you know, you might be better off if you haven't had that experience, having not had it. So on that wonderful, super happy light note, you guys got any more questions? Anything you want me to talk about in more detail? I'll just chill here and look at the chat for a second. Thanks, guys. Thank you. Cool. Sweet. I think I should drop this link in the chat really quick. 1 second. Do this on my phone. Yeah, and if you have any questions that come up, just let me know. I'm around. It's all good. Workshop. There we go. Okay, almost there. Okay. All right, I just put the doc in the chat. I can post it in the Facebook group also, if you don't grab it now. There's comment access on in it, so if you want to put a comment in, or you have a question or whatever, you can do it in the doc, or you can reach out to me directly. Yeah. Cool. Yeah, I think it's listening and feedback time. Thank you all so much. I hope this was helpful. Yay, so glad you liked it.